Ink up, slow down, write your rhythm with script and scribe.
Hi everyone, welcome. I'm Kat, and today we're looking at these 9 ostrich inks. And usually this is part of a series called My 9 Favorites because I choose 9 favorite inks from a particular brand or a particular color. But today something's a bit different because these are the only ostrich inks that I actually own. It's my complete collection, and I was going to say this is going to be the first time I'm experiencing it, and we'll share that experience together. But I actually started recording this video yesterday and had loads of interruptions, and the worst was the traffic outside my window. And I live in a rural area, but it was everyone coming back from work and revving their engines. Anyway, so I decided, let me just re-record because this is looking so choppy because I had to pause so many times. Despite that start, I thought it's well worth sharing these with you. I got them off AliExpress. It's the first time that I've bought fountain pen ink from them. I have bought journals and I've bought fountain pens, but this is the first time I got ink, and it arrived really well and quite fast. I like that it's small bottles because I don't need tons of ink at this point. So the size of the bottles is really good. It's not too tiny and it's not a huge amount. You can get bigger ones. The packaging is really good. I think that's pretty. I have to say that I've been in a heat wave. That's another reason I haven't recorded very recently. The little room that I do all the recording in gets so hot. And because it's been over 35 degrees, we had 37 degrees day before yesterday, a lot of things with adhesive have been coming undone, and that's included these labels. So although they're pretty, they definitely don't stand up to a heat wave in the UK, especially with all the humidity that we've got going on. But the question that I had before I tried these out is, are they going to be as good as some of my favorites from, say, Diamine or Wiringule and all of that? They are slightly different from the inks that I usually use because these 9 come from the Chromatography collection from this brand. If you've never heard of Chromatography before, don't worry, it's not as complicated as it sounds. Essentially, an ink usually dries into one color with tonal variations. Chromatography inks don't do that. The ink that actually is made up of a particular color starts dividing into its different dyes that make it up. So let's say it's green, and then suddenly you develop yellows, blues, and grays when it's drying. So it'll be interesting to see how much of an effect these ones have, because I've seen some chromatography inks that really just look like shading inks, but others are spectacular. And I have actually seen which are which, because like I said, I did this yesterday, but I'm not going to spoil it for you. You're going to discover it as I swatch these. Let's just have a quick look at the tools. 2 books so that you can try out the different papers, see how the inks react to them. This is the Midori MD, and usually I use Muji high quality paper, but I thought my Hobonichi 2026 notebook is underused and it's got Tomoe River paper, which is usually what a lot of people are interested in. So I think that will give us some interesting effects on there. Also, I'll be able to show you the Muji high quality paper anyway, because it was one of the books that I used yesterday. I used this Midori and the Muji. So you'll get to see how these inks perform on 3 types of paper. Beyond the paper, we have these trusty 3 cocktail stirrers that I got from Shein for £2 for 4. Unfortunately, I broke the 4th one, but 3 is a lucky number, right? Then we have this dipping pen, and I've stuck on a zebra G nib on there. And then, instead of using my usual pigment pen and a stencil to draw shapes and do the swatches in the shapes, I decided to use archival ink. And I sometimes struggle. I know that this is made to be easy, and loads of people do find it easy, but I sometimes lean too heavily on the edges of a stamp, and then I end up getting the ink on the page from where it shouldn't be. So I'll try to be less heavy-handed today and see if we can just get the bottle. And no, I clearly cannot, so let's just say it's got some rustic charm to it. Another thing that I liked about the way these are packaged is the quality control. So you can see when this was packed, they put little slips inside each box. And they also make sure that it doesn't leak during travel because they put in these rubber stoppers. But I don't get on with these very well. I do like that they're in there so that they don't spill during travel. But once they arrive here, it's really tricky for me not to have the ink all over my fingers each time I remove the stopper from the bottle. Now, something I hadn't realized about this ink is that they are a legacy ink going back to like the 1930s, and I'd never heard of them. And I think that's because they're not really stocked in retailers worldwide. They're mostly online from Chinese platforms like AliExpress and Taobao. So I knew nothing about these until yesterday. Anyway, here we go. And we're starting with Lotus's Dew. So this is immediately looking like a mauve, and I love mauve. It's almost making me sad that I sold my Sailor Pro Gear Slim in dusk because this color would go really well. I say almost because I've been trying to refine my fountain pen collection. I'm not truly sad, but I'm always a little bit sad because I want all the pens. Anyway, this is definitely looking dusky. I don't know what colors it might separate into. Let's do a long, thick line. And this is on the Hobonichi Tomoe River paper. And this is with the dip pen to see what it would look like writing with a fairly thin line. Now we'll do that on the Midori.
So yesterday when I did this, Midori had tons more shading than the Muji. There was one exception, I think, but it will be interesting to see how the Hobonichi holds up when compared to this Midori.
I think I wrote Dream on the other one. It's Dew. Let's have a quick look. Oh, well, clearly I want to rename this ink. But yeah, it's Lotus's Dew. And I can see some sort of like grey outline developing along there. So it'll be interesting to see. I don't really see the grey so much in this, perhaps there. Anyway, we'll see what these all look like at the end. They should be quite different from when they get laid down. Next we'll go with Chestnut Horse. This one's actually a lot cooler than I imagined. Not sure what I was expecting of the word chestnut and chestnut horse, but it's really lovely and cool leaning. It's also one of the ones where the pigment really sticks to whatever you stick in there. So for Lotus Dream, I had just a little bit of ink on the actual cocktail stirrer. This one, it stays on there a lot longer. And that means that when you lay it down on the page, you've got far more ink available to work with.
This is a lovely legible brown, so I'm very pleased with it. I'd happily use this as an everyday ink. I think to get the shading, I would have to use a stub nib. And it goes for all of the inks really. The broader the nib, the more of the shading you're going to see. But the interesting thing about all of the inks as well is paper, and I think it was a good choice to have this warm Midori to show how different the ink can look on a warm and a cool toned paper. So I'm seeing some warmth on the page with the Midori. It looks far more warm than it does on the Hobonichi paper.
This next one, Sycamore Tree, shows a lot more shading on the actual bottle compared to the bottles here. And so I was expecting to see a lot more effect, and it really was the case. We'll just enjoy what that looks like as you see it laid down and then how it develops all the different colors. I don't know if I would actually use it in a very fine nib, but it was surprisingly legible when I gave this a try.
Of course, I've only tried it with this dip pen, so that would be comparable to a fine nib, and I would be curious to see how it performs with a stub or a broad nib. I reckon the effect will be stunning. The Chinese sycamore tree is also known as the Chinese parasol tree, and it's famous for its broad leaves which turn beautiful shades of gold, peach, and brown in autumn. Looking at this ink, I think we'll see where the inspiration really comes from. I noticed when I first did this that it separated into very similar colors that we're talking about with that sycamore tree. So I've waited about 3 minutes and it is still wet on the sycamore tree. So I'll wait for it to dry completely, but we can definitely see the separation into the different colors, and it's got a lovely effect on this Midori. And we can also see some variety in there, a little bit of like purpley gray on the outside of the pink, the mauve. And here it looks like a lot of shading. So I wouldn't necessarily say there's tons of different colors in there, but it's still a lovely effect in the Chestnut Horse. But one thing that I'm impressed by is that the Midori has managed to not bleed through. Here you can see a lot of show through that's on the chestnut, and it's still looking very wet for the sycamore tree, which we know is drying, and then, no effect at all on the other side for the Lotus's dew. And then we look at the Hobonichi. It has dried a lot more for the sycamore tree. There's just a little bit of wetness in that section there. We are seeing less variation in the Lotus's dream than in the Midori. And again, here we're seeing loads of shading, but I think the shading effect is more in the Midori than on this Tomoe River Hobonichi paper. And Sycamore looking lovely, but again, we're getting more variety on the Midori. And then we have a look at the other side. And there's tons of bleed through all the way onto the next sheet of paper. But it does look pretty. I just do prefer the Midori at this point. Going on to Red Maple, which looks lovely on the box, so I'm hoping that we get all of that, but it doesn't look like there's tons of different colors. It looks more like shading again, so we'll see whether that's the case or not. It's definitely the one that colors my fingers the most when I pull out the stopper, as you can see here. There's just no way that I can seem to get that out without transferring tons of the ink onto my fingers. It stays on there really well, so that's kind of like Chestnut Horse. It's really well pigmented. I can understand why this one's called Red Maple. I think the name suits perfectly. The base color is a rich reddish brown reminiscent of maple leaves in autumn, and as it dries it develops beautiful layered shading. I think this one would look stunning in a broad and a stub nib. And we're switching from the cooler Hobonichi color paper to this warmer ivory tone in the Midori, and I can tell you I immediately love it. I do prefer all of the warmer tone inks on the Midori. It just makes the color seem to have an extra vibrancy about it. And if you're looking for an autumn ink that offers more than a simple brown, this could be a wonderful choice. And we're moving on to Green Robinia, which is a muted green. My first impressions were that this is very similar to Celadon Cat, but of course that all changes as the ink starts to dry and further develop. And that's what we're letting the Hobonichi do, dry and develop, and we're going to lay this down on the Midori. I really like this base color, and we'll just add in this thick line before we do the writing. I find this ink surprisingly easy to read because I made the assumption that it would shade to the very lightest that we see in the swatch and that would make it difficult to actually read the writing, but at no point do I actually feel that's the case, just when writing with it in practice. Next one is Purple Snowflakes, and this one actually reminded me quite a bit of Lady Grey from Diamine. Mainly because they're both purples that lean grey, and I love the way that these sort of inks work in a fine nib when they look uniform, dark purple, really sophisticated, and then when they have that depth of interest when you use a broader nib as well. Now, aside from this Hobonichi and then the Midori, you're also going to be able to see what this looks like on Muji, and that goes for all 9 of the inks, because towards the end of this video, I am going to do a side-by-side comparison of all 3 papers. Now, immediately what we see on the Midori is that the purple is slightly warmed up by that cream undertone from the paper. And to the right of this sample, the green Robinia is really catching my eye because I see this grey that's really come out of that green. It looks spectacular and it is still drying. This Evening Mist is one of my favorites so far. The base color looks a deep grey-green, but once the chromatography starts, you get hints of all sorts of colors. And it's the one that looked the most different on the Midori compared to the Muji. So I want to see how it looks on all 3 papers, the Midori, the Hobonichi, and the Muji. Compared with some of the paler inks in this collection, of course the saturation is fantastic for everyday writing, while still delivering some fascinating color shifts. And I'm about to show you how different this ink looks on different papers, because it was a real contrast between this one and the Muji. And now you're going to be able to see the contrast between the Midori and the Hobonichi. And again, this Tomoe River paper looks like it's dried quicker, but at this point I realize why, because it's just gone all the way through again. And this is still drying. And we're going on to Heat Bamboos next. Now this might be a silly question, but once you get these sort of bottles with the wonderful rubber stoppers in them to stop the spillage during travel, do you always put them back? Because I do. And now I'm wondering if I should be, because it's just so messy each time I get the stopper out. Perhaps I don't need to put it back in? Let me know. This Heated Bamboos is definitely far more vibrant than the colors that have gone before. Now, I do lean with muted colors, so I love the muted, but this one definitely pops. It has an edge in terms of the vibrancy. Perhaps Lotus's Dream comes next after that, but this one seems to sit outside of the rest of the color palette. And it also strikes me as a really good ink to be writing with, so it's highly legible. And now for the final color, which is Fall Chrysanthemum. Like the other browns that we've done before, the Red Maple and the Chestnut Horse, I feel that this one isn't going to separate into loads of different colors, but is just going to give us that shift, that sort of shading of the same brown. So a really earthy red brown, and in tandem or fitting with the fall season that it talks about. And if you like journaling with brown, I think it's a really good everyday ink. And we're finally ready to compare the papers, and Midori has it each time for me. Sometimes the Hobonichi and Muji look washed out. The saturation is a lot more on the Midori. Plus, you get a lot more vibrancy in terms of the complexity and the colors that come out of each of the inks. And the reason that they sometimes look washed out on Hobonichi and Muji, you'll see in a moment, it's because of bleed through. So it goes through the page and onto the other sheet, whereas you don't really have that happening with the Midori. So it takes a lot longer to dry on the Midori, substantially longer, sort of 2-3 times sometimes. And I don't mind waiting because the effect is worth it. I figured you'd like to make your own conclusions about the compatibility of these inks with paper. So this is the Hobonichi, and we've got feathering on some of the samples, and we've got bleed through onto the next sheet. This is the Midori. I can't see any feathering off the samples. I can see show through and almost bleed through on that top one, which is the fall Chrysanthemum, and on this one as well, which is the red maple. But otherwise, I think it's performed really well, especially because I was super generous with the amount of ink I was putting on these pages. Then having a look at the Hobonichi again, just to remind us what that looked like before we move on to the Muji. And here's the Muji. There isn't any feathering, but it will be interesting to compare the bleed through, because I know there's bleed through. Okay, so I think the inks on the right bled through as much as the Hobonichi, and the left not as much as the Hobonichi. But overall, I would say the Midori really works the best for these inks. Let me know your thoughts in the comments and whether you have any favorites. I know that for a lot of people, they don't mind bleed through when they're doing samples because they're using a lot more ink on the page than they would usually. But yeah, that's it. I hope you enjoyed this exploration of Ostrich Inks, and thanks so much for joining me. Take care.